In many ways, the war was the defining moment of Adams' career and a watershed in the history of the environmental movement, as the forces unleashed in the post-war years threatened the wilderness as never before.
My best guess is it was, in fact, the interstate highway system in the car. That as long as part of the country was really hard to get to, people took wildness for granted. And it was at the moment when suddenly everything was going to be out there where you could touch it that people began to say, wait a minute, if you touch a butterfly's wings, you ruin it. And maybe some of these places are more like a butterfly. Maybe if we touch them, then the scales will come off and the glimmer will be gone and the sheen will fade. And people began to question, I think, in the 50s, whether ease of getting there was always a good thing.
In the years to come, Adams would redouble his efforts to make Americans understand why wilderness mattered. Lobbying Congress for stricter laws, formulating policy for the Sierra Club, and writing countless articles and letters.
I bet he wrote more letters to the editor than any sane person in American history. At least 5,000. And he really thought this was a tremendous way to influence things. And he would just sit there, he'd type every one of them himself, you know, sitting there at his little typewriter. But that's how he worked. He was passionately involved. He was one of the great activists. He came to be known as Mr. Sierra Club. But his real impact on the 20th century American environmental movement was the inspirational value of his work, not made for environmental purposes, but they became symbols of the American wilderness. And I think that, to me, that's how he really made a difference.
Every now and then, he wondered whether the creative fires that had inspired him in his youth had begun to fade, or whether he had said all he had to say in the field of photography. But there was little time for such thoughts now, and in 1952, he embarked upon a series of magazine and book projects in collaboration with his good friend Nancy Newhall, hoping to reach an even broader audience with his message.
Confined by our own artifice, borne up on vast abundance and colossal waste, restless and disconsolate, we course across this dwindling globe that once seemed infinite, seeking somewhere, in some last far place, our birthright. The wild majesty, beauty, and freedom through which for 1,000,000 years man grew. Nancy Newhall, 1959.
Of course, the most important thing they ever did together was This Is the American Earth, which was published in the same year as Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. That was in many ways the single most important book that kicked off the kind of modern mass environmental movement. But Ansel's book was very, very influential in that process in the same year, and I think next to Silent Spring, maybe the seminal book.
3 years later, in 1963, Adams and Newhall would collaborate again on a vast retrospective exhibit of his work called The Eloquent Light that would consolidate his already considerable reputation and fame and mark the beginning of the end of the most fruitful part of his career.
At some point in the late 50s, the great creative urge began to dissipate. Certainly after the mid to late 50s, he made very few photographs of real consequence. Whether he felt he'd said it or done it, he continued to make photographs, but the drive was gone. He was 61 years old at the time of the exhibition, and many artists have much, much shorter periods of great productivity.
I think it probably has a lot to do with just plain stamina. I don't mean just physical stamina. The ability to kind of stay with it and continue to worry it and to do it from the other side, to try and to keep confronting this suspicion that you haven't really understood it yet, that you haven't found the right place to stand, you haven't found where the edges of the picture are, you haven't found really what the components of the picture are yet. It gets easier to abandon it half done when you get older.
And he felt very guilty about it. I first came to know him in the 70s, early 70s, and he was 69, I think, and he was always saying, well, I've really got to get out and photograph. You could tell that he felt that they were going to take his union card away or something. He really, it was guilt. He was a big man for guilt, but it didn't make any difference. He just didn't do it. And when he went out, nothing happened.
If you look at the few late pictures he made late in his life, Moon and Half Dome, El Capitan Winter Sunrise, oh my gosh, those are 2 of his 12 best pictures. And he made them on the spur of the moment when he happened to be in Yosemite with a camera, which shows he could still do it. And so I am convinced that the reason he didn't was he was always worried about the wolf at the door and money.
He was nearing 70 when the financial security that had eluded him all his life materialized at last, in the form of an enterprising one-time graduate student in forestry named Bill Turnage, whom Adams had met in the spring of 1970 while lecturing at Yale. Taking over the management of Adams' affairs, Turnage swiftly turned the Ansel Adams archive into a multi-million-dollar business, and Adams himself into a popular icon and the first mass-marketed fine arts photographer in the world.
Ansel, in his last years, became a cross between one's favorite uncle and Smokey the Bear. But that wasn't the real artist. I think that was somebody who had come to recognize that his best work as a photographer was behind him, and was proceeding to be an extraordinarily valuable member of society, as an educator, as a conservationist, as a spokesman for a lot of things that many of us regard as highly important. But that wasn't the greatest Ansel. In my view, the greatest Ansel was Ansel the artist, and that Ansel was operating at full steam for more than 20 years, which is very good for an artist.